Thank you very much, Diane. I dedicate my remarks today to Festival Artistic Director Matti Bunzel, who, in accordance with the theme of this year's festival, is soon undertaking a journey of his own to become the artistic director of the Wien Museum, which is actually a whole network of cultural institutions in the venerable Austrian capital of Vienna. And it so happens that Vienna is also the site for our investigation today of Beethoven's activities in the period 1809 to 1810, when Vienna was a war-torn city. And this has much to do with Beethoven's connection to political events. In 1809, early in the year, Austria declared war on France, and as it happened before, Napoleon's armies quickly defeated the Austrians. By the beginning of May, Vienna was besieged briefly and then capitulated to Napoleon's army. And it's in the context of this very turbulent and difficult period, 1809 to 1810, that we situate Beethoven's main artistic contribution of this period, the sonata known as the Farewell or Lebewohl Sonata, Opus 81A. Now that raises a number of issues concerning Beethoven's connection to the absolutist regimes that he experienced. And it reminds us also, as we move to this first image, of his highly ambivalent connection to Napoleon Bonaparte. Some of you may recall that Beethoven dedicated or considered dedicating his great Eroica Symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804, and this title page documents that situation. One sees right here, Intitulita Bonaparte, which has been forcibly erased underneath 804 in August, but actually then down here, very hard to read, is written as an addition in pencil in Beethoven's hand, Geschrieben auf Bonaparte, which shows the very ambivalent situation that is characteristic of Beethoven's attitude. Beethoven was quite taken by Napoleon Bonaparte when he was first consul of France in the period 1799 into the beginning of the 1800s, severely disappointed beginning in 1802 with his concordat with the Pope, and then even more so when Napoleon seized supreme power, crowning himself emperor at Paris in 1804. And we can depict this situation in the next images, the first of which is a positive image of Napoleon Bonaparte with an allegorical feminine symbol of France, which he's embracing. He's rescuing France here from ignorance and bringing France toward justice and abundance. And one notices then Napoleon's positive role placed right in the center of the image. Now, if we move to the next image, on the other hand, we see a German caricaturist or satirist in the period around 1814, the period of the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon's downfall, who depicts Napoleon's entire career. And we can observe here that from Beethoven's standpoint, the peak of Napoleon's career was not here, when he had himself crowned emperor, but indeed before. And this situation has everything to do with Beethoven's commitment to the ideals of the French Revolution, which sustained his point of view, and his being repelled by the absolute power that he experienced not just from Napoleon Bonaparte, but also from the regime in Austria. So now if we shift to the very next image, we see Beethoven at this very time when he had considered and then rejected the idea of dedicating his great Eroica Symphony in Napoleon, 1804. It's very interesting and very kind of manipulated image in some respects. One pays attention to the landscape in the background. It's even perhaps possible that we've got a couple of freedom trees there in the background. If we look up at Beethoven's haircut, that's even significant here. There was rather a mania, certainly a strong fashion from the 1790s, of haircuts a la Titus. And the idea there was to emulate the Roman Republic. It even became fashionable as a woman's hairstyle as the 1790s wore on. And if we turn back actually to Napoleon and then back to Luigi, you'll notice a certain kinship there as well. Luigi also indulged at this time in prominent sideburns that were regarded as some rather provocative in the courtly circles in which he moved. And unlike Haydn, unlike Salieri and others, Beethoven staunchly refused to wear court dress or to wear wigs. He was extremely sensitive about being regarded as a court flunky, you could say. And so it's in this background that we will approach the situation around the period 1808 to 1810 that concerns us in particular. But before we get there, let's also notice something else that Beethoven kept in his possession until the end of his life. This is a statue that he carted around with him. It's actually a statue of Lucius Brutus, an ancestor of the today more famous Brutus from the Shakespearean drama, and one from the 5th century before Christ. Lucius Brutus was much more famous in the 1790s because he was a founding figure of the Roman Republic, and as such was revered by our friend Beethoven. And now let's turn to the next image, and that is none other than Kaiser Franz of Austria. In other words, the monarch who was in power during the entire time that Beethoven lived in Vienna from 1792 to his death in 1827. And it's certainly the case that there was no warm relationship between Beethoven and Kaiser Franz. And not a single work, not even a trifle, was dedicated to the emperor. On the other hand, Beethoven had an alternative because there was a single member of the royal family of Austria who took a different tact, who wasn't interested in things military, and that was the Archduke Rudolf, who became Beethoven's piano student and composition student, and it's Rudolf who received all those important dedications. It's also the Archduke Rudolf who, in 1809, was the key figure in arranging an annuity for Beethoven to encourage him to remain in Austria, not to leave, to join the services of none other than Napoleon's brother Jerome, whom he had installed as King of Westphalia and Kassel, in what is now the middle of Germany. So we can observe here this tension, which is very strong, between Beethoven's artistic path and his dedication to the principles of liberty and equality, which are embodied perhaps most obviously and very profoundly in his opera Fidelio. And on the other hand, his situation and his experiences, his disappointments on the political front, where he found himself between a rock and a hard place, dissatisfied with the Austrian regime, with Kaiser Franz and dissatisfied with Napoleon Bonaparte as well. It might be observed further that Kaiser Franz, it's been said, had an almost pathological fear of anything democratic, anything progressive. And what didn't help exactly was the fact that his aunt, Marie Antoinette, had been guillotined at Paris in 1793, and he certainly didn't want this to happen in Vienna. So this maybe explains part of the background, but you can see from this Beethoven's basic attitude. Now, toward Napoleon in particular is this long-standing ambivalence, right down to the year of his death. In 1827, Beethoven made a very frank remark to one of his colleagues. He said, ja, in diesem Scheißkerl habe ich mich geirrt, regarding Napoleon. I was wrong about this shithead. Which cuts both ways, of course, because he had great hopes for Napoleon as liberator up to a certain point, as we can already surmise, and he was severely disappointed on the other. And another revealing comment on Beethoven's part concerning monarchs and monarchies comes from the period of the Congress of Vienna around 1814. And Beethoven commented after all of the ceremonies and the big public concerts, which he also cashed in on. He earned more money in that 1 year than was possible at any other time in his career. He could even make bank investments at that point. But some of the works he wrote were not very good, and he knew that they were virtually in the category of kitsch. And he then commented about this, that he'll not say anything more about the monarchs and the monarchies, that what he preferred was the empire of the mind. And so it was this other empire, the empire of the mind, that Beethoven developed and expanded right down to his last years. And one might say that in that regard, there was a kind of Napoleonic scope to his enterprise, but it was in the artistic sphere and not in the political one. So let's turn now. There is, by the way, Napoleon, having crowned himself emperor. There is his young brother, Jerome, installed as king. We can survey them one after the other. They all look sort of similar, don't they? And now we move to the piece that occupies us today, a fascinating large-scale piano sonata in 3 movements. And as you can see, Beethoven gave it a title. And that title also fits to the theme of the Humanities conference. He called it Lebe wohl, fare thee well. It's a farewell sonata. And as such, it opens in a fascinating way. And here I have to ask you to become good listeners. So let's turn now to the beginning of this piece. We begin with a kind of signal, and it's something characteristic of the beginning of the 19th century. It's a signal, 2 motives played together that suggest the post horn. And this conjures up the world of carriages and the post being brought by horse-drawn carriages from village to village, town to town, and of course leave-taking was at that scene in that way. And so this signal is associated in particular with the pastoral instrument par excellence, with the horn. And it sounds on the piano like this. Those are the upper voices that you see. Beethoven's first move, artistically, in taking over this trope, is that important C octave underneath. And we'll have more to say about this in a moment. But I want you first to imagine very intensely how this sounds with the sonority of the horn. And let's start first with the upper voice. G, F, E flat. And after I play it and I pause, I want you just think of this as a horn motive, as a horn sound. Could you hear it? I'm very impressed. And many of you may not have thought that you had such a vivid imagination for instrumentation, but there you go. Let's try the lower voice. Now this is going to be E flat, B flat, G, that spells out an E flat triad. Did you hear it? I'm really very impressed. I knew that I had heard about how good the audiences were here at the Chicago Humanities Festival, but this is really beyond my expectations. Beethoven's first real artistic decision here, once he decides to use this trope, associated as it is with text, of course, le, be, vol, is to place something under it that is less stable and really less expected. A C minor triad is thereby created, a certain darkening in sound, and this is how the piece then unfolds. So you heard how the second appearance of the descending motive G, F, E flat passes to a more distant sound, a more distant harmony on C flat. And this meditation on fare ye well, this gesture of departure, is like a leitmotif throughout the entire first movement of the piece. So that when we reach the main faster section there, allo, standing for allegro, we hear this. Beginning with this octave. Later on, when we reach the second part of the exposition of this piece, we hear in which the music is essentially saying, le, be, vol, le, be, vol, fare thee well. Now, when we reach the middle section of the first movement, something very striking happens. And that is that the elements of the heroic, which are very they're very much held in check, one could say, in this movement, that they lead us into a kind of labyrinth of farewells, multiple farewells. And that reminds us actually of the situation Beethoven lived through in the spring to the fall of 1809. He wrote about this in certain letters, and he talked about the distress, the suffering, and the fact that he felt that he could not work. And when he was able to get back finally to work on this particular sonata, he declared that he felt he was writing much more for death than for immortality. And there would be good reasons for this, because in part, the great battle of Wagram occurred in this general period. This was a horrendous battle with tens of thousands of casualties, and you can imagine how many people indeed bade farewell to their loved ones at that time and never returned. And there's something of this character in the middle of the movement, in particular, in passages like this. A long descending pattern, multiple farewells. The music sinks into this darker key of C minor. It has no strong goal direction back to the tonic at all. And even more moving is the last section of the first movement, in which the farewells build up one after another in this way. As if to say, leb vol, with tonic and dominant over one another. The second movement is called Abwesenheit, or absence, and begins like this. It has a lamenting quality in which the lament, with empty spots, as it were, depicting the absence, are alternating with an attempt to conjure up some sense of consolation. And it's only after we go through two such cycles that the music finds this important chord, which becomes the threshold to the Bittersweet, which is appropriately a duet. Here's the second voice. Leading to a kind of explosion of joy as the basic elements of the E-flat tonality with until the finale are finally released. And this is, of course, Beethoven's artistic solution to the dilemma. Even if there is no way between the rock and the hard place in political terms, there can be in artistic terms. And this is kind of the vessel of idealism, of human striving, of ideals that comes to fruition. And Wiedersehen, as it is, it enables us also to anticipate the joy that we'll experience when Matti Bunzel comes back to visit. So we'll now hear Beethoven's sonata. Thank you very much. I know it's part of our framework here to entertain questions, and we still have a quarter hour for that purpose. So I believe there are microphones that will be circulating, and I see one question right here.
I don't have a music background, so I would appreciate if you could explain when you said he couldn't resolve the problem or the issues politically, but he could in his music. And could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes.
The way in which he resolved it, the issues.
Beethoven shared with Schiller the conviction that the work of art could serve as a kind of reservoir or vessel of positive energies, and that at times when politics or society was in disarray, was confronted with severe problems, that the artist could resist acceptance of that situation through an artistic statement, and hence, even at certain points, that the artwork could slumber through periods of oppression and misunderstanding, and at a later point be understood for what it was, that is a cultural entity carrying within it the seeds for improvement of society and inspire others at a later point. And what I'd suggest to you, and as a work like this, it's built into the very structure of the work. To be sure, Beethoven also, because he dedicated the work to his friend and student, the Archduke Rudolph, he actually entered the dates into the score when Rudolph departed, fleeing the French invasion in May 1809, and when he returned 9 months later in January. But this is only there because of the dedication. Typical for Beethoven is that the work of art would have a broader, more sturdy relevance. And so I think this framework of farewell, absence, and then renewal or reunion has a clear symbolic meaning. It also points toward some of his most visionary works of his last decade, in which one can recognize this kind of utopian thrust emerging in works that can have a very tragic beginning.
How did the Emperor Concerto get its name?
It's very much misnamed, I'd say. And I think that has to do with the British reception of the piece, more than anything. It's very remote from being a piece that Beethoven wrote in any admiration for Napoleon, at any rate. In fact, in the sketchbook in which he developed the ideas for the Concerto in E-flat, Opus 73, it's the same general period as this piece, slightly earlier. One notices him making sketches for some patriotic Austrian songs that would be explicitly anti-French. So it's certainly not a work, it's not an ode to Napoleon in any way. Yes?
With the disappointment in the Austrian absolutism and what Napoleon was morphing into, is there any history in Beethoven's career of any interest in the New World and its ideology and idealism?
That's a very good question. There are not many references that I'm aware of in the Beethoven documents and papers to the New World in that particular way, although one might want to do a more thorough search. For one, of course, the more liberal-minded or democratically minded thinkers, including some of those associated with the American Revolution and the history of America, they also shared an interest in Freemasonry, which was a strong influence on Beethoven, even if it's never been proved that he was a Freemason. And his principal teacher at Bonn, Neefe, was extremely active in the Freemasonry groups and the groups that emerged out of them, like the Illuminati. And it's groups like that that commissioned Beethoven's first important composition altogether, his cantata on the death of the reformist emperor at Vienna, Joseph II, a work of 1790. Yes?
Did he sample his own work to borrow a hip-hop word? Yeah, it seems to me that I've heard themes that come in later sonatas in 28, 29, 30, 51. Does he do that and borrow from himself and develop something later?
Very good question. To what extent a piece like this is bound up with, for instance, some of his later works. When we hear something like this, for instance, with this remarkable trill here, I think of a development of that being something like that's another kind of utopian symbol at the very end of his final sonata, Opus 111, in which the trill very high up is even more intense, and the textures, remarkably written by a composer who was virtually stone deaf and couldn't hear it acoustically, the textures are even more ethereal, and yet they're definitely implied by passages in the finale of the sonata you just heard. So I certainly agree with you, and there would be more that could be said about that. The second movement is also quite extraordinary in its pregnant dissonances and its psychology. Other questions? Yes, here. This gentleman.
Over Beethoven's life, I have the impression he started primarily as a performer on the piano and then composed basically for his own use. Did that change after a while? Did he stop performing as much and do more composing?
Yes, Beethoven's beginnings as a composer were closely tied to his gift for improvisation at the keyboard. And that is what so impressed early audiences above all else. And in fact, the memories of his extraordinary improvisations were so vivid, even in his later years, that his friends begged him in connection with the first performances of the Ninth Symphony in May 1824 to consider improvising, because they thought that's what would draw in the big audience and assure that there was not a loss financially for the concerts. What happened, however, was that already when Beethoven wrote this sonata, his hearing had been eroding for about a decade. By 1818, he was so deaf that all his visitors and friends in order to converse with him, had to write everything down. And people still tried to entice Beethoven to improvise at the piano, and sometimes they succeeded, but he couldn't hear anything himself, and apparently gained little enjoyment from a process of improvisation in which what he produced was not acoustically available to him. And so it was rare in the later years that he would actually improvise. However, we have a great trade-off for this. Beethoven was a very hard-working composer, and as he became more deaf, he committed more and more of his work, including the very earliest ideas, to writing. And so we actually have an extraordinary record of his improvisations, and they're all written down. Yes?
As a student, a scholar of this man who could not hear acoustically, are you also interested in brain science, and specifically brain science involving music?
Oh, certainly. And I'd love to learn more about it. And if you or others can offer me some tips, then I would be... I'm very interested also by Beethoven as a creative figure who was endeavoring to convey something that Schiller also was very concerned with. Beethoven admired Schiller's works, not just the dramatic and poetic works, but the philosophical works, like the Aesthetic Letters of 1795. And what Schiller promotes, and that Beethoven's art seems to confirm, is that musical art, and other arts too, have the enormous advantage that they can blend aspects of the human experience that are often kept too apart from one another. In other words, the head and the heart, rationality and sensibility, structure and nuanced expression. Schiller argued that the value of a successful artistic performance is to bring these dimensions that are too often separated from us in our experience into a closer relationship, and they bring us closer in touch with our inner potential. And that this would be a great mission of art, one that other areas of endeavor cannot accomplish the way this type of activity at its best can succeed in doing. Yes?
It would seem to me that that's an example of what you've done today. And I'd just like to, I'm not an accomplished musician, but to see if you agree with that.
And this will be our last question.
I would be extremely pleased if that's the case, because that was my goal. Thank you.